Chapter 5, The Glass Eye. You can play a lot of tricks with a glass eye because you can take it out and pop it back in at any time you like. And you can bet your life Mrs. Twit knew all the tricks. One morning, she took out her glass eye and dropped it in Mr. Twit's mug of beer when he wasn't looking. Mr. Twit sat there drinking his beer slowly. The froth made a white ring on the hairs around his mouth. He wiped the white froth onto his sleeve and then wiped the sleeve onto his trousers. "You're plotting something," Mrs. Twit said, keeping her back turned so he wouldn't see that she'd taken out her glass eye. "Whenever you go all quiet like that, I know very well that you're plotting something." Mrs. Twit was right. Mr. Twit was plotting away like mad. He was trying to think up really nasty a trick that he could play on his wife that day. "You better be careful," said Mrs. Twit, "because when I see you starting to plot, I watch you like a wombat." "Oh, do shut up, you old hag," said Mr. Twit, and he went on drinking his beer. His evil mind kept working away on the latest horrid trick that he was going to play on the old woman. Suddenly, as Mr. Twit dropped the last bit of beer down his throat, he caught sight of Mrs. Twit's awful glass eye staring at him from the bottom of the mug. It made him jump. "I told you I was watching you," cackled Mrs. Twit. "I've got eyes everywhere, so you'd better be careful." Chapter 6, The Frog. To pay her back for a glass eye in his beer, Mr. Twit decided he would put a frog in Mrs. Twit's bed. He caught a really big one down by the pond and carried it back safely in a box. That night, when Mrs. Twit was in the bathroom getting ready for bed, Mr. Twit slipped the frog between her bed sheets, and then he got into his own bed and waited for the fun to begin. Mrs. Twit came back and climbed into her bed, turning the light off. She lay there in the dark, scratching her tummy. Her tummy was itching. Dirty old hags always have itchy tummies. Then all at once, she felt something cold and slimy crawling over her feet. "What's the matter with you?" Mr. Twit said. "Help!" screamed Mrs. Twit, bouncing about. "There's something in my bed!" "I'll bet it's that giant skillywiggler I saw on the floor just now," Mr. Twit said. "What?" screamed Mrs. Twit. "I tried to kill it, but it got away," Mr. Twit said. "It's got teeth like screwdrivers." "Help!" screamed Mrs. Twit. "Save me! It's all over my feet!" "It'll bite off your toes," said Mr. Twit. Mrs. Twit fainted. Mr. Twit got out of bed and fetched a jug of cold water. He poured it over Mrs. Twit's head. To revive her, the frog crawled out from under the sheets to get near the water. started jumping about on the pillow. Frogs love water, and this one was having a good time. When Mrs. Twit came to, the frog had just jumped onto her face. This is not a nice thing to happen to anyone in bed at night. She screamed again. By golly, it is a giant skinny wiggler, Mr. Twit said. It'll bite off your nose. Mrs. Twit leapt out of bed and flew downstairs to spend the night on the sofa, while the frog went to sleep on her pillow. Wormy spaghetti. The next day, to pay Mr. Twit back for the frog trick, Mrs. Twit sneaked out into the garden and dug up some worms. She chose big long ones and put them in a tin and carried the tin back to the house under her apron. At 1 o'clock, she cooked spaghetti for lunch, and she mixed the worms in with the spaghetti, but only on her husband's plate. The worms didn't show because everything was covered with tomato sauce and sprinkled with cheese. Hey, my spaghetti's moving, cried Mr. Twit, poking at it with his fork. It's a new kind, said Mrs. Twit, taking a mouthful from her own plate, which had no worms in it. It's called squiggly spaghetti. It's delicious. Eat it up while it's nice and hot. Mr. Twit started eating. Twisting the long spaghetti on his fork and shoveling it into his mouth. Soon there was tomato sauce all over his hairy chin. It's not as good as the ordinary kind, he said with his mouth full. It's too squishy. I find it very tasty, said Mrs. Twit. She was watching him from the other end of the table. It gave her great pleasure to watch him eating worms. I find it rather bitter, Mr. Twit said. It's got a distinctly bitter flavour. Buy the other kind next time. Mrs. Twit waited until Mr. Twit had eaten the whole bowlful. Then she said, You want to know why your spaghetti was so squishy? Mr. Twit wiped the tomato sauce from his beard with a corner of the tablecloth. Why? He said. And why it's got a nice bitter taste. Why? He said. Because it was worms, cried Mrs. Twit, clapping her hands and stamping her feet on the floor, rocking in her chair with a horrible laughter.